afternoon. Appreciate opportunity to be here and talk with you a little bit about some of what we have done in addition to the studies that you've seen here. All of this is kind of going back into the Nashville Next process, which is a regional plan looking at the next 25 years, what is right for Nashville, what is next for Nashville, what's next for this region, and is based on some of the information here and how we're going to sustain and the quality of life that we're looking for as we go forward. This is a 10-county area, seeing as it's a power of 10. We'll be growing over 1 million people over that time period, and one of the biggest challenges we're going to have, not only in accommodating the growth, the 1 million people we're going to have, but also in preserving the character of life and character that we want to for our communities, the distinctiveness of our communities, and so understanding where that growth is going and what's happening is critically important. If we look out over the next 25 years, we're going to see Rutherford and Williamson County being over 500,000 people each. Think about that for a minute. They're going to be the size of Davidson County in the year 2000. I can remember Davidson County in the year 2000. And so if we're going to preserve the character that we have of this region and the distinctiveness, we've got to be making plans now, and not only in Davidson County, I think, but in the region. And that's part of the purpose of this, is to kind of think through how these lessons and how the things we've learned will apply to your community as well as ours. We're going to have a very different community. We're facing, as a country, major changes that we have not ever had to face in terms of our country and our community. And how we react to that is going to be extremely important. If you look out, but basically in terms of Davidson County, by 2040, much more diverse population, a lot higher Latino population, African American, Caucasian, and others. It's going to be a very different population mix. And those characteristics follow through for the region as well. We're going to have a very different age structure. We're not going to be faced with, and these things will show up in a little later as I go through here, we do not have a population bell curve in this country. We have a population barbell. On one end, we have the gray tsunami, myself and cohorts that are aging boomers. On the other hand, the other large group are the Gen Ys, or the millennials, coming on, and there's not a lot in the middle, as you'll see as we go forward in terms of this. So meeting the needs of those two groups are going to be extremely important in decision making and in community building, and we're already beginning to see what the demand of those two generations and the impact those two generations are having on the housing market itself. If you go back to 1960, when I was in high school, basically 50% of all of the households were households with children. You look out to 2040, 80% of the households are households without children. The single largest household group by that time, in fact it's pretty close to being the single largest group right now, are one-person households. And a one-person household is looking for a different housing stock than a household that has 1, 2, or 3 children at home. I want to start a little bit by taking some of the findings from where we started our planning process about 1.5 years or 2 years ago with a regional planning survey to try and understand what some of the key issues were in the region before we went out and actually began engaging people. We started with a 2,000-person telephone interview survey, 1,000 people in Davidson County, 1,000 people in the rest of the region, and came out with a series of priorities: public education, you can see, job creation, public safety, etc. We also did 100 in-depth interviews with thought leaders throughout the region, and education, economic development, job creation, and transit were at the top of that list as well. So what were the basic findings of that? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time. All this information is available on Nashville Next website, as well as Jeff's study and Joe's study are both all available there if you're interested. But one of the things that was particularly that came across extremely well was the Nashville region is extremely, the positives are here. People love Nashville, and we see that. People feel very strongly about Nashville. They want to live here. They want to participate. They want to have Nashville be the best place that it can be. The highest priorities that we found were, again, education and jobs. I don't know that there's a particular surprise in terms of that, but again, extremely important. There was a high degree of consensus of the importance of education, and particularly how do we fix our K-12 issues. For those that are not able to hear the mayor's State of Metro speech today, he came across very strongly in terms of supporting funding for the pre-K program, which we think is extremely important and a key element in terms of strengthening the public education program. But his proposed budget includes funding, the full funding for the pre-K program. And just to kind of mention that, I think that one thing, and Jeff may correct me on this, one of the things that I've admired about Washington, D.C. is their universal pre-K program, which has been available for all residents of Washington, D.C. And what that has done is it has gotten families that may have not been interested in the public school system back invested in the public school system through in effect, educated daycare program, if you want to be as crass as that. But what that does is it begins to translate into continued involvement and investment in the public school system as those children become into kindergarten and into elementary school. And so not only is it beneficial to the children themselves to be prepared for study, and I think one of the most critical elements, but it is also a way to re-engage the community in discussing the public education program. Affordability is an important issue in terms of housing affordability. One of the things that we found throughout the region was that citizens actually had a higher consciousness of affordability issues than did maybe the thought leaders there, and that's kind of come through as we've seen. But people are conscious of the issue, and one thing we have discovered as we're seeing more and more redevelopment in our infill. Now, it's very beneficial from Joe's analysis. It's extremely beneficial from the work that Jeff had. But it creates another issue that we're going to have to wrestle with as a community, and it's, I guess, commonly referred to as the suburbanization of poverty. As more infill locations change and higher income people move into those areas, then lower income people are moving to more suburban locations that are not as able to be served with transit, not as able to be served by public services and all. Small businesses and entrepreneurs are perceived as needing more support. This is a high growth area of our economy. We are a maker economy. We are a thinker and doer entrepreneurial economy, and we need there's a need to recognize and support that and build on the work that a lot of groups are doing right now in terms of trying to foster that as a key economic segment of our community. Multiculturalism is seen as a plus, which is good because it's coming whether we like it or not. And so, but generally the region embraces the multiculturalism as it's evolving and sees that as a way to build community assets and to build community strengths. There's a recognition of the demand for transit. Aside from education, transit is our biggest need in this community if we're going to be able to provide for our economic future. But it's not really seen yet by the public as being as high a priority as it is or as it needs to be. And so that's going to be an issue as we go forward. Sustainability is important. We've looked at how we define that. The whole issue of climate warming and climate change may or may not be out there, but there's a little doubt that we're having to deal with hazard mitigation and other issues that relate to sustainability as we go forward. And I think one thing that's really strong about this region is that there is not a perception, at least in the community, that there is anybody that's actually one particular group has its own agenda and driving the decision process. It's perceived as being balanced with all players at the table and all players being part of the decision making as we move forward. And that's something that we've tried to take advantage of through the Nashville Next project. A couple of things that kind of grew out of this. What was the ideal community? And you'll see these here, energy efficient homes. A lot of people want to age in place, and that's going to be something as you begin to see the aging boomers in terms of how do you provide services and what are those services and what do those neighborhoods look like. The ability to get out and walk, locally owned businesses, neighborhood parks, a mix of housing, all of those, and availability of public transit. All these that make great spaces and great places are critically important, not only in Davidson County, but were identified as very important through the rest of the through the rest of the nation. And there was, I guess, both the region and in Davidson County recognized some of the shift in changing, some of the changes in these demographic things, the smaller household sizes, the older population raised in racial and ethnic diversity. That's something that most of our residents in the region understood. Number one, kind of again reflects that consciousness of affordability and transit, growing economy, walkable neighborhoods and strong neighborhoods, safe neighborhoods, all key priorities there. Another study that we had to kind of augment the work here was trying to understand what are the trends and preferences and opportunities that we have as we move forward in terms of comparing our housing stock, our housing demand, commercial stock, and all that. We hired Chris Nelson, Dr. Arthur Nelson, who is was at the University of Utah, now has just moved to University of Arizona, to do this. And he's written nationally on this and has carried out studies throughout the country on some of the key issues. And once again, you begin to see the household changes that I mentioned in terms of what the county, Davidson County was in terms of having couples with children at home, and then some of the housing preferences as we change to that situation where you're going to have 80% of the households that don't have children at home. Then there's a different housing preference in terms of looking for smaller houses. Location is much more important, smaller lots, attached housing is important, and the demand for different housing types. And this is one thing that really did strike us because it was not something that I don't think a lot of people really consider. If you go back over the last 20 years and you look at the age of households, what you found is that 70% of all households were in what were the peak home buyer age classification, the 35 to 64. So 70% of all the households were looking for housing that primarily would support a family, children, more of a suburban environment. If you look to where that is over the next 30 years, and this is simple, again, this is straightforward, simple math, that 70% goes down to about 30%. Are looking for kind of the conventional, if you will, suburban single-family detached home. You have almost as many that are starter homes, and again have that characteristic of smaller households, single-person households, as well as boomers and downsizers. So there's a lot of increasing demand for a smaller housing product, and there's a lot of opportunities as we go forward looking at things like attached dwelling units, looking at townhouses, looking at stacked flats or apartments, and looking at some of the elements that bring. And in fact, what he found that in Davidson County was that our housing demand over the next 25 years, 75% of all the housing that will be built in Davidson County, the demand is for rental housing. And that's a different mindset than what we have thought about historically. He broke this down and led by different groups as well. In addition, we're going to basically need almost twice as much new non-residential development as we already have here by the age of the structures and the demand for non-residential development. So there's a tremendous amount of new non-residential development. How do we preserve what we already have? How do we add on to that in a way that creates quality spaces? And we've already begun to see this in Nashville and Davidson County. This map illustrates all of the infill development. Those of y'all that are around here, you keep hearing this about infill housing, tear-down housing, housing on corridors. But it simply reflects the changing demand and the changing preferences of the population that we are looking at as we go forward. So hopefully some of these ideas have challenged you a little bit to think about where you want to go with your community. How do you want to preserve that? And I'll talk a little bit later this afternoon about where we're going with this information as we go forward. Thank you very much.